May 14th, 2019. Texas Monthly article by Leif Reigstad was a disappointment. I was disappointed in Leif's article. He painted Joe to be a tragic character who wasn't responsible for all the harm he did to wild animals, the people in his life, his family, his community, and to those of us who tried to end the abusive practice of breeding cubs for pay-to-play. In the comments, it appears others had the same disgusted reaction to the story. He seems to have taken Joe at his word on so many points that could easily have been disproven. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the article was Joe's threats from jail. Leif wrote, "I asked him if he regretted posting any of the things he had about Baskin. He said no, explaining that he had to act tough online in the face of hostile animal rights activists. He reiterated his claims that he was framed, and he questioned the motives of the prosecutors. Quote, 'Am I in jail until they can shut down this industry, or am I taking the rap for all of these people?' Unquote. His voice rose, and his tone grew darker. Quote, 'Come hell or high water, at some point I'm going to make world news, okay? Something's going to change in the name of Joe Exotic,' unquote. I asked him what he meant. Quote, 'This is a recorded telephone, so I'm not going to tell you that,' unquote, Joe said. Quote, 'But at some point, you bet your ass, I'm going to make world news,' unquote. While the wildlife trafficking was mentioned briefly, Leif spent more time trying to discredit me by dredging up Dawn's disappearance. I've hoped that the murder-for-hire story would be the vehicle for getting the bigger problem of cub petting and private ownership out to the masses. Leif bought Joe's story about Gerald's great love of animals, which their siblings say wasn't so. He credited the duo for being clever marketers in their failed zoo business, but failed to mention that it was funded on borrowed money they never paid back because Joe filed for bankruptcy. That was critical to our story because he knew you could promise to pay anyone any amount and just file bankruptcy to get out of paying. Leif bought Joe's alibi of saying that he was ready to move on, and that's why he and Dylan had moved to Gulf Breeze. Despite all of the evidence of his association with the Gulf Breeze zoo owner, Gretcher Mogensen, Joe was painted to be someone just trying to start over, rather than someone hiding from the law and trying to figure out how to get to Belize, where he said he couldn't have been extradited. He would have been wrong. Leif described Joe via one newspaper calling him a master illusionist, but anyone who ever saw Joe's show said it was amateur and lame. The only draw was to pet the tiger cubs. If Joe had been any good as a magician, he wouldn't need cubs to get attention. He did mention the first time Joe's path crossed mine, and it was 2004. I didn't remember noticing Joe was all of his aliases until 2009, but reporters were saying I'd criticized him earlier. This was the quote. In July 2004, the Oklahoman published an article about a crippled lion cub named Angel who had been born at the zoo, a possible result of inbreeding. Quote, "No legitimate animal sanctuary would allow that to happen," unquote, said one activist quoted in the piece. It was Carole Baskin. Leif mentioned Joe being fined $25,000 by USDA, but failed to point out that USDA had charged him with over $300,000 in fines, and it had settled for $25,000 so they didn't have to bother with prosecution. Instead of using words like everyone else has to describe Joe punching cubs, he said swatting. He talked about Joe's increasing revenue being from donations, but everyone knows Joe got very few donations. He made the most money selling cub petting and selling the aged-out cubs. Instead of calling Joe's restaurant ventures what they were, selling the public food that Walmart had thrown out for being expired, he said Joe was building a brand. Leif said I built the 911animalabuse.com site to answer the question of where people should donate their cats. I told Leif it was because people would ask whether places were worthy of their financial support, so I posted the facts and let them decide. He tried to make it sound like I was competing with Joe for animals to rescue. Leif mentioned Joe killing 5 older tigers to make room for the circus cats who would pay boarding, but he failed to mention that they were specifically chosen because they weren't producing cubs anymore. It sounded like they were at the end of their time already, instead of the even more heinous act that it was. Leif said that it was clear Glover wasn't going to kill me, so Garrettson tried to set him up with the FBI hitman. Glover testified that he and Joe were in conversations about him killing me until March of 2018, I think, which was probably why Joe never ponied up more money to hire the FBI agent. I believe Joe thought Glover would come through. It was also left out of the story, despite being in the testimony, that the FBI and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service thought Glover was out of the picture and that their fake hitman was in play. They didn't learn differently until June or July of 2018 and were totally freaked out that they had a hitman who was not under their control, paid, armed, and under the guise of a fake ID out there the whole time. Leif described my testimony saying, quote, "She was composed on the stand and pointed out that what had been shown in court was just a very, very small sampling of what he had said about her over the past years," unquote. I never cared a bit about what he had said about me. The evidence we had stockpiled and that I had attested to were all of the threats he had made against me. Fact checkers had even asked me about one line they had wrong, where Leif had quoted me as saying, quote, "If Joe were handed a strict sentence, it might not deter others," unquote. And I had corrected it to say, quote, "If Joe were handed a strict sentence, it might deter others from wildlife trafficking," unquote. What ended up in the piece was wrong. Quote, "She hoped that if Joe were handed a strict sentence, it might deter others in the exotic animal industry from operating a zoo like his," unquote. We've said all along, if Joe had settled with us and just agreed not to breed cubs and offer cub handling, he'd still be running his zoo. No matter how clear you try to make something for the media, they almost never get it right. The piece wasn't a total waste, but it fell far short of having the impact it could have if it had been researched and reported more accurately. If you're enjoying my diary, please like, share, and subscribe. You can find other ways to connect to me over at bigcatrescue.org/Carole.Baskin.